The city had learned to hold its breath. All summer long the wind came up from the sea with a taste of brine and tar and fish scales, and the alleys baked under their own smells, and the black water crawled past like a serpent asleep. In the red keep the air did not move at all. Heat lay upon the stones in a languor that made the tapestries hang limp and the torches burn small and blue. Servants padded barefoot because leather soles slapped too loud on the floors and echoed through the vaults. Even the ravens muttered less, as if the unblinking sun had convinced them that sound itself was dangerous. From the high windows of the Tower of the Hand, the city looked lacquered, as though a painter had glazed its roofs with the same dull sheen that coated the river. In the throne room, the same light picked out every chip of dragonstone and every crack in the great floor where the scales of dragons were said to have fallen and shattered. In that hall the king sat and stared down from a height as if the world were a thing seen through a slit in a door, a thing he could shut out if it displeased him, and so he often did. They told him the lions had come. Lions? Aerys asked, head tilting, nails clicking against the arms of the iron throne. The nails had become claws. He had abandoned trimming them because steel was treacherous and because their length pleased him. They were dirty as they curved from his fingers. A pride of lions in my city? How droll. On the ground beyond the king's gate, your grace, said Grand Maester Pycelle, his beard wagging as if it were speaking for him. The banners of House Lannister are seen in great number. The Lord of, he swallowed. The old man had learned to choose each word as if it might explode. The Lord who was once your hand is encamped with many thousands of men. Varys said nothing. He stood with hands tucked like a well-fed spider keeping its legs to itself, powdered and perfumed, his gaze downcast, the courtier's art of diminishing his own body into the fabric of a room. Ross' art of the alchemists, in his green-black robes that stank of smoke and sweet oils, moved one slippered foot against the stone and watched the king's face in the flame of a candle. Tywin. The name was a taste. Aerys rolled it in his mouth and spat it out. Tywin. Winds of Ty. He thinks to win my city. Does he? To roar at my walls? Let him roar. Let him... He leaned forward, the corner of his mouth wet. Is the chain ready? The chain is always ready, your grace, Rossart said, and his voice was a murmur that seemed to come from under the floor. The jars rest where you commanded. The rats cannot gnaw through iron. Rats, the king said softly. Rats in the walls, rats under the floors, rats in the bellies of women. The Rat King of Casterly Rock has come to feed. He laughed then, a dry little sound that startled the closest cupbearer into spilling watered wine on his own hand. I will not open my gates to rats. Your grace, Pycelle began. Perhaps a parley. The city is sore-pressed for grain. With Prince Rhaegar fallen at the Trident, we must burn, the king said. We must burn first, before they can take what is mine. His eyes flicked to Varys. Is that your counsel, eunuch? Is it? Tell me which of my enemies you are today. I am your servant as ever, Varys whispered. And I am afraid. Afraid. The king smiled, showing teeth crowded like tombstones in a forgotten yard. Good, good. Fear makes the wine taste sweeter. He turned his head, and something like cunning moved behind his eyes. Send for him. Your grace, Pycelle said. Send for Tywin Lannister. Tell him that his king will receive him with honor, that I wish to forgive and to be forgiven, that the gates will open for him and his household only. He will understand that mercy is as sharp as a sword and must be handled carefully. Go, Pycelle bobbed. At once, your grace. Varys did not move. He did not so much as breathe. Aerys' nails beat a little tattoo on iron. He will come, he said. He will come as a mouse creeps into a trap for a taste of cheese, and the cheese will be green and the mouse will squeal. He giggled then, and the sound rose and fell in an empty way, like something trapped in a glass. In the White Sword Tower, a boy in a white cloak was binding his hair back with a strip of leather when the bells began to speak. They remembered how to cry for war as quickly as for weddings and for death. Ser Jaime Lannister stood very still with the leather between his teeth and felt his stomach sink as if a trapdoor had dropped beneath him. He had not slept. When he closed his eyes, he dreamed, and in the dreams there was always fire. He would wake with the taste of ash under his tongue and the feel of grit against his teeth, and it took him a moment to understand that the grit was only his own clenched jaw. He was 17 and knighted too young, and his sword felt heavier lately, though he had not lost strength. "Ser Jaime," said a voice at the door. It was a gold cloak with a scar on his cheek. He did not meet the Kingsguard's eye. "His Grace commands your presence." Jaime tied his hair in silence and drew on his gauntlets. When he looked up, his face was a thing carved out of what his father had taught him to display. The white cloak lay over his arm like a weight. He had once thought it the finest thing he would ever wear. Now he couldn't tell if it warmed him or chilled him. "Lead on," he said. They took him the long way to the throne room, through corridors that smelled of oil and wilted flowers. The courtiers waited in bunches like grapes, whispering, their whispers a little hissing that rose and fell with the movements of servants. He recognized some faces and knew the names attached, and others he had forgotten. Varys stood by a pillar and did not glance his way. In the great hall the light lay strangely, as it always did, refusing to fill corners and collecting instead on the jagged metal above. The king's hair had become a gray mane shot with lank streaks that clung to his temples. His hands were bare. The nails appeared darker than yesterday. He smiled, and Jaime felt a small muscle jump beneath his left eye. "Jaime," the king crooned, "there will be a show." "What is your pleasure, your grace?" "Obedience," Aerys said, and his lips shaped the word as if savoring it. "Stand there." He pointed with a claw, and Jaime stepped where he was told and stood. His sword hung at his hip in its white scabbard. The scabbard had never looked whiter. Rossart moved in the peripheral dark like an eel, and Jaime heard the faint chime of glass. The king's gate creaked open later than it should have, grudging in the heat. Tywin Lannister rode through with a dozen knights only, all unhelmed, each man dressed in the sober reds and golds of a house that did not need bright, busy livery to announce itself. The Lord of Casterly Rock sat a little straighter in the saddle than he had the year before. Age came to him in bone and tendon, not flesh. His face was a chiseled mask that showed itself as it wished to be seen, and the city's stink washed over him without visible offense. He noticed, as he always noticed, the gaps in the lines of men along the street, the grayness of the wash hanging from windows, the broken pavers that had not been set right since the last flood. He had time to mark these because the procession was slow and because a man like Tywin Lannister had made a life of seeing what others missed. He thought of a different procession long ago when he had ridden as a young man through this same gate to be named Hand, and of how many nights he had spent in that tower above the city, shrinking what was untidy and growing what was useful. He did not think of his son. He had trained himself over many years not to think of that boy when it would distract him. At the foot of Aegon's high hill, he dismounted without assistance and walked into the Red Keep on his own feet. The red stone drank heat and none returned. He climbed the long steps to the hall. Men fell away around him, as if an invisible scythe were swung quietly and precisely through the air. The king was already smiling when Tywin came in. It was not a stable smile. It trembled over the sharpness of his face. The Iron Throne made a hedge of black thorns behind him. To Tywin's left, Varys inclined his head, and to his right, Pycelle lifted a hand and let it droop again. Jaime stood 40 paces away, white cloak ghostly. Tywin's eyes passed over his son the way a general's eyes pass over a piece on a room-wide board. "My king," Tywin said, and did not kneel. "Hand," Aerys said. His fingertips clicked again, an insect on iron. "Are you a hand empty, or a hand dripping red? Show me, Tywin. Show me your fingers." "I have come to render you the truth," Tywin said. "The truth is that the battle is lost. Lord Stark and Lord Baratheon approach, with their host and with their rage. Cersei is no queen. You have no ally so sure as my men beyond your walls. Open the gates and acknowledge Robert as your successor. And, the king breathed, and This is what a rat says when it wishes to be stroked. Your daughter. His mouth twisted. Your daughter is a sow in a golden pen. Tywin did not blink. He had been stabbed before and known it only when blood wet his shirt. You raised me to speak plainly and rule firmly when you named me hand. I did both. You repaid me by placing my son in a cloak that cheats my blood. What did you think I would be when you took my heir? Grateful? Amused? You raised me to bluntness, Aerys. So be blunt. Choose, Baratheon or Lannister. You cannot have both. Choose, Aerys whispered. Yes, yes. He leaned to one side, claws clicking, eyes bright with some inward lightning. I choose a different fire. 2 gold cloaks stepped forward and then 2 more. Tywin did not turn his head. He saw without looking the shape of a table being rolled toward the center of the hall, the copper basin upon it, the twined rope like a garden snake upon the floor. Rossart's slippers whispered. The pyromancer's smile was a small crescent in the green gloom. You summoned me for theater, Tywin said. For justice, Aerys said, and the words seemed to slip in his mouth. You ruled my kingdom. You thought to be king in all but name. Even your dogs said it. What did the mute one say? That Lord Tywin ruled the 7 kingdoms. And so I took his tongue. This time I shall take more. Tywin looked past the king then, for the first time, and allowed his gaze to rest on Jaime. Not long, not pleading. A measuring, the way he measured tables and rooms, the weight of a thing in the hand. No fear in it. Only a faint, dry amusement like the dust at the bottom of a wine jar. Jaime did not move. His throat worked once. Bind him, the king said. They took Tywin's arms and he did not resist. The rope bit into his wrists and the green-tinged basin was lifted, carried to the very center of the room. Rossart inclined his head as if to a queen and poured from a jar that shone as if it were full of melted emeralds. The smell was sweet at first, then strong as a slapped face. Do you smell it? Aerys whispered to Jaime, delighted, leaning down from his throne. Do you smell the dragon? It is like pine in winter and like a woman's hair when she is afraid. Tywin looked down into the liquid. He had once looked down into a newborn's eyes and seen himself reflected, tiny and distorted. Now he saw his own face in the clearness and it did not waver. This will not save you, he told the king. This will unmake you. Words, Aerys said. Words burn too. He made a little motion with one claw. Rossart lifted a long iron with a coal at its tip no larger than a berry. He did it with tenderness, like a priest touching his god. He dipped the iron in the green. The flame ran rapid up the length and bloomed like a flower. The first scream was brief. It ceased because the breath that made it had been stolen for fire. When it came again, it came through clenched teeth and sounded like a man cutting his way through thorns with a dull knife. Jaime stepped forward 1 pace before he realized it. He stopped where he was ordered to stop. His white cloak brushed the floor and picked up dust. He had seen men burn. At the whispers at Duskendale, behind his eyes when sleep failed. There was a peculiar violence in burning that exceeded the violence of blades and clubs. It animated the body past its owner. The arms jerked in old dances. The shoulders flinched in an animal logic. The eyes searched for water where there was none. Tywin did not beg. His mouth clenched like a hand. The smell filled the hall. The smell would never leave the hall. Pycelle wept, either because the smoke stung him or because there was something left of a man in that old bulk of his. Varys did not. He studied the flame with a thin regard, and then he studied the king's face, and then, very briefly, his gaze passed to Jaime. The look was like a finger pressed to lips. It took much longer than anyone would have guessed. When it was done, the basin held a syrup the color of old coins, and the rope ends smoked in 2 little spirals on the floor. Aerys sighed, heavy with satisfaction. Now, he said softly, now the lions may roar. When the messenger reached the Lannister camp, he had lost his horse and his hat and much of his mind. He stumbled into the space where the command tent stood and fell to his knees in the dust. He could not show his face because the dust clung to the tear tracks that marked it. Adam Marbrand lifted him with 2 fingers under his elbow and set him on a stool, and Ser Kevin poured watered wine in a tin and held it to his lips until the gulping steadied. "Say it once," Kevin said, voice flat. He was older than Tywin by a few years and had never tried to carve himself into anything hard. He had the broad, practical hands of a man who would prefer to be counting granaries. His eyes were dry and furious. He made a show of it," the messenger said. "In the hall, the pyromancers, the smell. It stuck in my hair." Adam's jaw worked. "Who sent you?" Lord Tywin commanded. The fellow whispered, as if hearing his own voice in that form soothed him. "If I did not return in a quarter of an hour, I was to come back with what I had seen." He was not surprised. "He knew," Kevin said, and closed his eyes very briefly. When he opened them again, he looked older by years. "Well, Ser," Adam said. He made such a small sound with his teeth that the messenger flinched. "Say the word." "The word," Kevin repeated. "Storm," Adam said. "Starve. Send word to Robert. Or break and run for the rock and let the realm think us cowards as well as father killers." He stepped forward, checked himself, stepped back again. "Ser, my lord, whatever I call you, give me something to put in the mouths of our captains." Kevin lowered the tin and set it very deliberately on the table. "We do not run." "No," Adam agreed hoarsely. "We do not run. We send riders to Lord Stark," Kevin said. "Ride south and west. Find them on the King's Road or on the river trail. Tell them what has been done. We build dikes and rams and dig. We do not spend men like coin at a gaming table. Our enemies have walls and wildfire and a madman. We have patience, numbers, and the memory of what we are." "Lions," Adam said. "Men," Kevin corrected. "We are men. Put that in their mouths before you put lions in them." That night the camp stretched like a dull red ribbon along the riverbank. The fires were banked low because no one wished to see flame leap suddenly and think of the hall. The men ate in silence, which was a mercy for the cooks. A drummer somewhere near the King's Road tried a march and lost the beat and stopped. Even the horses felt the shape of the night and pawed the soil carefully. At Dragonstone, the sea could be heard through walls the thickness of towers. Rhaella Targaryen drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders and watched her son sleeping. Viserys had his thumb in his mouth and his silver hair lay across his brow like seafoam. He had not cried when the ship pitched out of sight of land. He had stared with the interest of a child at gulls wheeling and then slept like any boy after a long day. Rhaella stroked his hair and thought of the other children she had held who had never woken on another morning. Willem Darry coughed in the doorway. "Your Grace," he said, "the last of the ships have signaled. No sails but ours." "Praise," Rhaella whispered, and did not speak the word that passed through her head. She had learned that the gods listened with a spiteful care. Her womb was a graveyard. The gods had been present for each internment. "And my lord husband?" Darry paused. "He remains in the city." "He will burn it," Rhaella said. "He has always loved to burn." Darry did not answer that. He bowed instead, the bow of a man with a sword at his hip and a child in his charge, and left her with the sound of waves. In the tunnels beneath the Red Keep, men moved with care as if every step might wake a sleeping giant. The alchemists kept these places, and so did other men whose maps were whispers and whose doors were not seen. Varys walked with a lantern hooded so tightly that light escaped only enough to show the next 3 paces. The boy beside him breathed too loudly. "Hush," Varys said gently. "Even stones carry tales." The child nodded, eyes wide, clutching the bundle that might have been laundry or driftwood. Far above them the king had laughed and then sung and then laughed again. After that had come a silence that weighed the room down like another ceiling. Varys had waited until the silence spread all the way to his own rooms. Then he had begun. The door he wanted was like all the doors here, a seam where the wall did not quite meet itself. He put his hands where hands had been taught to go generations ago, and it breathed open. The girl within lifted her head. She held her brother to her as if he were a rolled tapestry, and she was afraid of tearing the edge. "You must come now," Varys whispered. "The hall smells worse than it did this morning." Elia Martell rose with the careful movements of the very weary. The infant stirred, mouth seeking, but did not cry. Elia's eyes were feverish and bright. The journey from bed to bed within the same chamber had become a long road for her. "I cannot run," she said. "I cannot climb. I cannot anything. But I can walk slowly." "Slowly will do," Varys said, though he did not believe it. He took the boy's bundle from the child who had carried it and transferred it to his own arms as easily as another man might accept a goblet. Slowly will do. They moved like a small dream among bigger ones. Twice they stopped and pressed themselves into the cold when he heard other footfalls. Once a whisper crossed another whisper like two streams meeting. The boy looked back at the door they had come from as if a favorite toy lay just beyond it. "You will go far from here," Varys murmured, and was not sure to whom he spoke. On the King's Road south of the city, Eddard Stark watched crows rise from a field and wished, for the 100th time, that he had brought more men who knew the river as they knew the cold. Jon Arryn had grown thinner in the last fortnight. Grief bleached men faster than snow. Robert lay half asleep on a litter, his wound bound with linen that was not clean enough no matter how many times the maesters changed it. "We must be quick, Ned," Robert muttered, not opening his eyes. "We must be quick before he—" the breath caught and stuttered, "before he throws them to the flames." Eddard looked down at his friend and saw, as if it were carved into the bark of a tree, the boy who had chased him along the riverbanks once upon a time. He put a hand on Robert's shoulder and felt heat. "We will be as quick as the land allows," he said. "There are Lannisters at the gate." Jon Arryn raised his head, the white in his beard nearly pale as water. "Strange roads bring strange companions," he said. "Tywin was always a man who could count." "His son is in a white cloak," Eddard said. He had a memory of it as clear as if he had been present. The bare-faced boy in shining mail the day the king had smiled like a knife. "If Tywin comes to King's Landing, he comes to do what is useful to Tywin." A rider came then, a Lannister man with a white cloth tied to his spear and a face set in the rictus of formal courage. He bowed from the saddle as if from a dais and made the proper salutes. "My lords," he said, "Ser Kevan Lannister seeks parley under the walls. The man swallowed. He brings tidings of Lord Tywin." When the parley was set, the sky had found the courage to turn gray, and a little breath of wind moved off the river and stirred the hairs at Eddard's temple. They met on no man's land within bowshot of the walls. Each side had archers, but none had strings drawn. Kevan Lannister wore plain armor that had seen too much use to be purely ceremonial. He looked like a man who had just learned the weight of his own name. "Lord Stark, Lord Arryn." He stopped, and for a heartbeat it seemed that he would add more titles, more courtesies, anything to avoid the next words. "Robert Baratheon, I had hoped we would speak with your friend upright." "He will stand when it is needful," Eddard said. "Say what you have come to say." Kevin's mouth flattened. "The king brought my brother into the hall and burned him. We have come to burn the king's pride in return." His eyes went past them, to the walls that climbed the hill like a wave turned to stone. "We will not storm. He has wildfire everywhere. We will strangle." "And the people within?" Jon Arryn asked, and his voice held something sharp Eddard had rarely heard in it. "Strangled with them? We will open the gates," Kevan said, and the pale complexion that Lannisters were known for did not permit the flush that might have betrayed the intensity of the words. "We will open them if we can. But until they are open, we will not throw men at green fire to ease our consciences. Will you stand with us? Will you stand aside? Or will you try to ride past my lines and spend the last of your strength on a wall that spits flame?" Robert's eyes were open now. He had dragged himself upright despite the soft protests of the maester who attended him, and he looked at Kevan as if the man were a spear he might throw. "I will have the king's head," he said softly, and the softness was worse than any shout. "I will have it for Elia and for the children." Eddard felt a muscle in his jaw leap. "We will have it because justice demands it," he said. "Not for trophies." "Trophies?" Robert repeated, and the word was the edge of a smile that did not rise. I collect heads now." "Stand with us?" Kevin said again, and for a moment the last of his courtesy fell away, and there was only the plea of a man who had lost the one thing that had held his own house together. "I do not ask for friendship, only for alignment, for the length of a siege." Jon Arryn's eyes went to the walls. "We will stand," he said quietly. "Not for you, Ser Kevin, nor for your brother, but for the realm." For 2 days and 2 nights the drum of picks and shovels was the city's heartbeat. The Lannister engineers marked where the ground fell and where it rose, where old drains could be widened to drown men in filth, where simple wood would make a tower tall enough to speak to the battlements. The rebels sent men to carry timber and fill baskets, and they fell into the work with the grateful ferocity of men who can give their hands to something that will not think of them afterward. Inside, the king did not sleep. He had never been a great sleeper, even in the time when he had been lovely and curious and dangerous in an entirely different way. Now he paced, and his nails made score marks in wood, and he spoke to men who did not know if they were being dismissed or knighted until the next sentence left his lips. He sent Riella away because the sight of her belly, concave as a broken bowl, angered him. He sent Viserys away because the boy's hair reminded him of his own, and because he did not enjoy being reminded that he had once been someone else. He kept Rossart and his apprentices near. When he wanted to smile at the thought of fire, he looked at them and smiled. "Soon," Rossart murmured, as if soothing a hound before a hunt. "Soon, your grace. With one torch, 100 flames will answer as if they had been waiting for the word." "You hear them too," Aerys said with delight. "Oh, I knew you did." Jaime heard other things. The murmur of men in the barracks, the scratch of a rat in the ceiling, the dull shock of his own heart when it struck the inside of his ribs. He had stood in the hall and breathed the same air that had turned his father to a stink. He had stood. He had obeyed. He had been faithful. He had been faithful to a man who now, eyes bright as a fever, whispered with a pyromancer about burning tens of thousands of souls. He went to Varys. "You have a way out of every room," he said when the door was shut, his hand on the pommel because the feel of it steadied him. "Tell me the way out of this one." Varys looked at him with those gentle eyes that had fooled more men than daggers. "Some doors only open from within," he murmured, "and some doors, once opened, cannot be shut again. You are very young for your cloak, Ser. You were very young for whatever you became," Jaime said. "Tell me something I do not know. If he orders the city burned, will you stop him? Can you stop him?" Varys's hands folded delicately. "No one man can stop a river once it finds its fall, but one stone can turn it, or break it, or be ground into sand beneath it." "Speak plainly," Jaime snapped. "Plainly?" Varys's lips curved. "I do not like plain things. They crack." The smile died. "The alchemists have placed their jars beneath septs and granaries and guardhouses, in the vaults and the tunnels, in places where the wind runs to feed a blaze. Rossart keeps the last lights. If Rossart dies and his apprentices lose their nerve, the fire will be delayed. Not stopped. Delayed. How long? A man might ride from one end of the city to the other in that time," Varys said. "A man might open a gate. A man might do very many things." He lifted his gaze to Jaime's face and held it with an odd tenderness. "But a man who does such things will never be only one thing again." Jaime left the way he had come, with the slippers of the eunuch silent behind him. He did not go to the barracks. He went down. The steps that had been carved into the hill long ago were cool and damp, and after the first turn the smell changed to the breath of old wells. He passed a door and then another and found the place where Rossart would be, because men like Rossart kept their sanctums near the sources of what gave them joy. "Ser," said a thin voice in the torchlight, half awe and half fear. "You cannot be here." "I am here," Jaime said and drew his sword. Rossart was an old man, but he moved like a much younger one when he saw the white cloak. Fear gave him that. He clutched for one of his pretty green jars, and Jaime's blade moved because it must. The first cut was to the man's arm and the second to his throat, clean and fine. The work his instructors had praised in a yard where sunlight had been a thing that seemed like it would exist forever. Rossart fell with a sound more surprised than pained. He did not curse. He did not beg. The apprentices screamed. Jaime took 2 more steps and did what was needful with a speed that shocked him. Afterward, the face in a copper plate looked back at him with his own eyes and something else in them, a little glitter that had not been there the day before. He could feel, under his breast, a door swing on its hinge and fall open. He left the torch where it was and ran. Above, the bells began again. The bells found a new voice, a voice of alarm whose syllables were old as cities. Jaime ran the length of a corridor and shouted, and men who might not have obeyed him yesterday obeyed the white cloak. The words were simple as bread. "Open the gates." He said it to the gold cloaks and then to the men at the windlasses, and he did not explain himself because explanations are for later. "Open the gates." The king's gate shuddered and lifted. Outside, men who had been waiting more than their bodies could stand for this moment stared, and then they moved like water finding a breach. The first to enter wore lions and the next stags and wolves. Eddard Stark came in at the head of a wedge of men from the Vale and the Riverlands, his sword quiet in his hand. His face did not change when he saw the white cloak at the foot of the yard. "Take the halls," he told his captains. "Hold the septs. Touch no woman and no child. Anyone who lights a torch without orders will hang." The orders flew like birds to every perch. Jaime walked alone into the throne room. Aerys stood with his hand upon the arm of the throne, his nails plucking at the metal as if at a harp. He stared past Jaime's shoulder and smiled. "Fire," he said happily. "Fire, fire, fire." "Rossart is dead," Jaime said. The king blinked. "You no longer smell of your father," he murmured, as if only just noticing it. "Did you wipe him from your cloak? A good son." He tilted his head. "Where is Rossart? Bring me my hand of fire." "He will not come," Jaime said. "Then I burn you," Aerys said. He did not shout. He said it with the serenity of a man announcing a festival. "I burn you and the city and the old gods and the new. I burn everything that would rather serve a usurper than a dragon." Jaime took 1 step. He could feel every scar on the leather that wrapped his hilt. His mouth was very dry. He tried to moisten it and tasted the sweet of the alchemist's oil still clinging to the back of his throat. "You are not a dragon," he said quietly. "You are a man." The next breath he took had metal in it. He moved. It was not a beautiful cut. It had too much desperation in it to be beautiful. It was, however, very final. The king's eyes became a child's for an instant, astonished and unwilling to understand. His hands clawed at empty air and then at Jaime's chest as he fell. The nails left lines in the white. Silence after, the kind that follows thunder, when the world listens to its own echo. When Eddard Stark pushed the doors inward, they swung and went too far and struck the stone with a boom. Jaime was sitting upon a step with his sword across his knees and blood on his cloak in a peculiar pattern, as if a painter had flicked a brush. The body behind him could have been a tailor's dummy for the lack of life in it, save for the way the hair had fallen over the face. Eddard stopped because he was not a man who hurried past the important things. He took in the throne, the boy, the blood. "Ser Jaime," he said. "Lord Stark," Jaime answered. He sounded very young to his own ears. "Who did this?" Eddard asked, though the answer was like a word written on the wall in a child's hand. "I did," Jaime said, and could not keep from adding, "He meant to burn the city." Eddard's gaze moved from Jaime's face to the body and back. He thought of the stories of Duskendale and of what had been done in that hall the day a father and a lord had been burned like autumn brush. He thought of Elia of Dorne, whom he had never met, and of children he had only heard named. He thought of the smell that had drifted over the walls earlier and made his horse toss its head. "You are your father's son," Eddard said at last, not as praise. Jaime laughed then, once, and heard the laugh with surprise. "Not today," he said. "Today I am only the king's killer." One hand rose and pressed the iron of his brow above his eye, as if something behind it ached. "Do what you came to do, Stark. His body is cooling, and there are other rooms where worse things may be happening." There were. The Red Keep had never liked being entered by men not born within it. It resisted in innumerable little ways. Men who had laced their boots that morning in a tent by the river bled upon tiles where courtiers slipped in silk. A gold cloak tried to snatch a necklace from a woman's throat and died with an arrow through his ear before his fingers closed. A baker's boy handed a sword to a man with a boar on his shield and then began to cry and could not stop. Word moved, though like fire when it finds tinder. It went before Eddard, hissing, that the White Wolf had said no torches, and the men who had come with him obeyed from habit and from the shape of his jaw. The Lannister men, too, checked themselves because they were being watched by other men, and because their lord's brother had said only one word to them, men, and there was something in that word that stung pride and held it steady. In a small, clean room beneath the rookery, Varys laid one sleeping boy beside another and exhaled as if he had been holding one breath for a decade. "Hush," he whispered to Elia, and touched her hair with the delicacy of a man who had once, very long ago, believed in tenderness as an art worth practicing. "Hush." A girl with black hair looked at him from a corner with eyes that measured him. She had a piece of string and she wound it around her fingers and unwound it and never stopped looking. "Hush," Varys said again, though they made no sound at all. In the Lannister camp, a girl who had never liked being told when to speak or how to sit sat very straight on a stool and made her voice do what she had been taught voices could do to men. "He was my father," Cersei said, and the captains and knights who had seen her as a bright thing to be traded saw the sharpness under the guilt. "You will take the city, and you will keep your hands where Captain Marbrand can see them, and any man who does not will lose what his hands are for. When the gates open, you will go where you are sent. And when the war is done, you will remember that I remember." Adam Marbrand bowed, mouth tight. "As my lady commands." "I am no lady," Cersei said. "I am a Lannister." When they brought her the word that the bells had changed again, that some new shape of sound had laid itself over the old, she stood so quickly that her stool tipped and struck a tent peg and stayed there. "Go," she said to no one in particular. "Go and be faster than whatever the bells mean." Night had come by then, and the stars above King's Landing were too sharp to be trusted, hard little glints like the edges of coins. The smell of smoke lay down with the smell of old food and old bodies and tried to make a new smell that men would have to learn. In a chamber that had witnessed so many announcements that it felt like a thing with a throat, Eddard Stark told men that the king was dead, and that the realm would be guided now by the judgment of living men and not by the appetite of a ghost. He did not say, not yet, what would be done with the prince and the princess if they could be found. He did not speak the name of Robert in that room because names had a way of flashing into other men's eyes and making them rash. He looked at the boy in the white cloak instead, and thought of what doors had opened within him and would never shut again. "Guard him," he told his men, and it was not lost on him how strange a command that was, in a hall where so many had bled. Jaime sat where they put him, and the blood dried on his cloak in patterns that would look like nothing to anyone who had not been present when they were made. He thought of his father's face and could not remember it as a face. He remembered instead a door, always ajar, leading to a room that smelled of vellum and lemon oil and contained within it the exact shape of his father's silence. A boy with straw in his hair peered around the doorframe and then scuttled away. The black iron behind the throne cooled. The torches flared and guttered, as if uncertain whether it was permitted. Under the city, tunnels breathed. Somewhere, a child slept in a basket with a ribbon tied to his wrist, so he would not be lost in the dark. Somewhere else, a woman put her hand on the belly that had refused to swell with any more life and felt it ache in the absence of fire for the first time in many days. On the river, barges bumped gently against one another as if exchanging confidences. In the Lannister camp, Cersei lay on her back on a pallet and counted to 1,000 and did not weep. At dawn, the light was pale as milk. The ravens found courage to speak again. In the yard, a man with a boar on his surcoat took a deep breath and stretched his arms and felt, surprised, that he was alive. It was in the nature of dawns to make men feel that. He went to find his lord. Robert Baratheon stood in a doorway with one hand against the stone, as if the tower would otherwise pitch him. His eyes were bloodshot but clear behind the blood. "Where is he?" he asked. "In the hall," Eddard said. "And the king?" Robert's mouth twisted. The word sat badly on his tongue. "The old king. Dead," Eddard said, as gently as words allowed. Robert nodded once. He stood a long while with his head bowed and then lifted it and laughed, and the laugh had an emptiness in it. "I thought it would feel like wine," he said. "It feels like water. Ned, we must find those children." "We will," Eddard said. "And if they live, what then?" Robert asked. And this time when he laughed there was bitterness, not emptiness. "Do we set them to fishing on the Blackwater? Do we send them to the wall, small as they are? You will tell me some decent thing to do, and then I will do some other thing, because kings do not get to be decent men." "You are not king yet," Eddard said, and there was iron in it. Robert looked at him and smiled, genuinely, for the first time in a long while. "No," he said.
"No.
Not yet." In the rookery, a raven pecked at the rim of a dish and looked as if it knew a secret. Across the city doors opened. Across the camp's men looked toward the walls. The day went on. It would be a long day, and after it another, and long days lend themselves to bad choices and to small acts of grace. Men would make both. They always had. Cersei stood on the walls in the full sun and stared at the red of the keep until the colors bled into one another and formed a shape she could carry with her. "He took him from me," she said once, under her breath, and did not specify whether she meant the king or the boy in white or some god who had made them both as they were. Jaime, in a room that smelled faintly of lemon oil and of old paper and now of steel, considered the palm of his hand and did not recognize the lines there as the lines that had belonged to a son. He had made himself into something that would serve, and now he could not be unmade. Somewhere beyond the walls, men argued about what to call Robert Baratheon. Somewhere beneath the floors, Varys blew out a candle and let the dark have its way with a plan. The city, which had held its breath, let it out very slowly. On the steps below the throne, where the dust made delicate maps, the tracks of white and red crossed and recrossed and did not resolve into any pattern that would help a man who wanted meaning. Meaning would have to be made, as it always was, from choice and from the price paid for choice. The sun climbed and the heat came back and the flies returned to their business. Sometime before noon, a young squire sent to fetch water stood in the doorway and had to lean his head against the wood to stop his legs from trembling because he had never been so close to a dead king before. Men spoke and wrote and sent birds into the haunted air. A lion lay dead and a dragon, and the realm rearranged itself within its own shadow. Toward evening, Eddard Stark walked the corridors in which he was now permitted to give orders and stepped into a chamber where the light fell kindly. The room had once been used by a woman who had taught young girls to stitch. There were still needles in a dish, thin as hairs. He stood there for a long time, thinking of daughters and of sons and of promises made on cold mornings. When he came out again, the hall had filled with men who pretended not to wait for him. He lifted his head. "Find Lord Varys," he said. "Find Ser Kevin Lannister. Find me whoever keeps your histories in this city. We will set down what has been done, and then we will decide what must be done." He did not speak of the prince and the princess. Not yet. The shape of that choice would come to him later, as choices did, in the hour when the ambitions of men fell quiet and the ghosts of the honorable became loud. Night fell a second time, quick as a coin dropped into deep water. Somewhere a child woke, certain that someone had spoken his name in a kind voice, and went back to sleep with his fist curled under his chin like a small stone. Somewhere in the dark, a woman drew a curtain tight and made a vow with clenched teeth and an unblinking stare. Somewhere a boy in a white cloak dreamed of green fire, and of water running under the city, and of the exact moment when a blade separates possibility from what has been. The city slept at last, not well, but from exhaustion. The wind off the sea returned with a hint of salt that made men dream of ships. In the Red Keep, beyond the shuttered windows, the Iron Throne gleamed very faintly in the moonlight, as if something in it liked to be looked at regardless of who did the looking. The ravens settled and tucked their beaks under their wings. The bells did not speak. In the days to come, men would call the hour by many names. They would write about it in different inks and argue about what had mattered and what had not. They would put the dead into their proper lists and lift the living into new arrangements. Tyrants served by clever monsters had fallen before and would fall again, but no fall is like another. This one had its own smell, its own scars, and its own quiet acts, all of which would linger long after the first retellings turned blood into paint. And beneath the stone and the stories, in cellars where jars had been set and not yet found, the wildfire dreamed its algae-green dreams of the world remade. It would dream for a long time. Men would walk above it and forget to be afraid. They would remember. They would forget again. Such too was the city's way. For now there was breath, however shallow. There was a morning that had not yet been wasted. There were men who had not yet chosen how to spend themselves. Cersei Lannister watched the Red Keep until she tasted rust and said nothing. Jaime Lannister sat where the blood had dried on his cloak and said even less. Eddard Stark, who said little by habit, found himself full of words he could not yet speak. The realm waited, as if at the lip of a river, wondering whether the water would fall or turn, and whether the stone that had lodged in its throat would hold. The second day wore its own face. The light came up over the Red Keep in chalk streaks and threw long bones of shadow across the yard, and the men who had slept on tiles with their helmets for pillows woke with the stiffness that follows a day when things long kept from their proper places are set right with violence. In the kitchens, the women moved as if they were at a wake, careful with their knives, gentle with the bread. Somewhere high in the airy reaches of the castle, men hauled down red and black and left the poles bare while their captains argued over what should fly in their place. Eddard Stark kept moving so that the rooms would not settle on him and still him. He had learned long ago that grief, like a snowdrift, deepened when a man stood too long looking at it. He counted stores and found them thin where they should have been thick. He found grain sacks slashed and latrines that had not been emptied for days because the gold cloaks had gone to ground rather than meet a temper they had learned not to trust. He sent quiet men to the seps to speak to the septons and to the docks to still the hands that would otherwise steal and call it survival. He sent trusted men to stand in the rookery and at the treasury, because men who called numbers were tempted by zeros when the masters who had set them were removed. In the hour before noon, he stood in a small room with a window that faced across the inner ward and watched 3 boys try to catch a stray dog who had learned in one morning that new lords meant new scraps and was having none of it. When the knock came, he knew whose knuckles made that sound. He nodded, and the eunuch's powdered head came around the door. "Lord Stark," Varys murmured. He had shed his violet for a dun that made him look like a moth that had lost its taste for candles. "If I might beg a quarter hour in a place where the stones do not repeat the business of men too loudly." Eddard had chosen this room for its quiet. He left the window open and leaned one hip against the sill. "Speak." Varys stepped in and looked at the floor in the modesty of someone who has brought something indecent into a clean house. "Your orders last night prevented much ugliness," he said. "It is easier to stop a fire at the first ember than at the edge of a roof. Captain Marbrand of the Lions is a man who can hear a sentence all the way to its end." That pleased me. His eyes lifted. "There remains, however, what we spoke of 2 nights past and pretended we had not." "Elia," Eddard said, and the name moved through the room like a draft. "And her little ones," Varys added. "The king is dead. A certain hunger that sat often on his lip has passed to another mouth. Lord Baratheon will be king within the fortnight if men follow their hungers and their promises in the usual ways. He is not a cruel man by taste, but he dislikes what lives with a claim to trouble him later. He will ask for the heads of dragon children as if he were ordering beef for his table." "Do you have them?" Eddard asked. "I have them where men who do not know the map of this keep will not find them. Men who think they know the map will also be deceived." Varys inclined his head, as if to a lesson given to a slow student kindly. "If you say nothing and do nothing, They will be discovered by some Ned who is eager to please a lord by finding something he has not been told to find. If you say, give them up, they will be sent up, and then we will have a different conversation that I do not wish to have with you. If you say, remove them, they will be removed. To Dorne, Eddard said. To wherever men with quiet hands and honest eyes prefer not to pray to the seven, Varys answered. Dorne is a place. There are other places. Some places are not places at all but people. I can make a people for them. You will not make ghosts, Eddard said, and the iron in it surprised even him. You will not bring me the sight of two little corpses made convenient. Varys bowed low enough that a man would be forced to consider whether he was mocking. I have done ugly things for kings. I do not always do ugly things for myself. He lifted his head. Lord Stark, I do not tell you this because I crave your regard. I tell you because you are as likely as any man living to put a good knife into my belly if I do something you think unforgivable. I prefer to keep my bowels unperforated. His eyes softened. Will you say the word? Eddard thought of a camp in winter where he had given meat to a stranger's children because they had cried in a way that made even his men look away. He thought of the way Robert's mouth flattened when the name Targaryen was uttered, of the heat in the man's body under his hand. He thought of Lyanna. He thought suddenly and with real force of Lyanna. The room seemed to narrow around him to the width of a passage a rider might take to find a tower that a map did not admit. Remove them, he said. The words left his mouth like a breath held too long. And if you bring me proof they are dead to satisfy others, I will not look at it. Wise, Varys murmured. One should not get used to looking at what one cannot change. When will you do it? Before the sun is wider than a shield, Varys said. The city grew under kings who like to hide, keeps their habits. There is a boat. There is always a boat. Eddard nodded and turned back to the yard. The boys had caught the dog. It accepted its capture with sudden, complete resignation and licked the dirty hand that touched its head. If he looked at such little domesticities too long, he would miss the larger ones and men would die. You will not tell me where they go. I will not, Varys said. So that when you are asked you may say with a clear conscience that you cannot say. He paused. I confess, Lord, that I do not know what you would do if you knew and were asked by a friend. Then it is well that you do not know, Eddard said. He did not watch Varys leave. He listened to the footfalls grow light and then be nothing. He found Ser Tywin Lannister in a guardroom near the King's Gate sitting on a stool with his hands on his knees like a farmer who had just seen to the beasts for the night. The gold in his hair looked dulled by sweat and dust. Around him, captains hovered and departed on errands with the intensity of men who had discovered the comfort there is in taking orders from someone whose orders do not wobble. Ser Tywin, Eddard said. Lord Stark. Kevin's eyes flicked to the door and then to the men. Leave us, Ser Adam. See that the Western men keep to their quarters. I do not want to hear that a man in a red cloak has celebrated the sack that did not come by visiting a brewer's wife. When it was quiet, Eddard said, The prince and princess. Kevin flinched only a little. Aye, where are they? Hidden. They must go to their mother's kin, Eddard said. If Robert asks for their heads, I will stand before him and take the weight of his anger on myself. I ask you to take the weight of your house's honor on yours. Kevin's mouth worked. Men will say that we spared Targaryen children for advantage later. Men always say that about Lannisters, whatever we do. My brother, the words caught. He forced them out. My brother would have weighed this differently. He had a way of placing things on scales I do not possess. You possess a different balance, Eddard said. One that the realm might prefer to use now. Kevin exhaled. Send them. If you can, send them by a path that does not look like the one to Sunspear. He lifted a hand when Eddard would have spoken. Not to deceive the Martells. To deceive men who will stand shoulder to shoulder with your friend and shout his name because he is strong and because their throats enjoy the sound. A dozen of those men will also consider what price might be paid for a prince's head. Let us make it hard to count. Your lady sister will call you a coward, Eddard said. She has called me worse, Kevin replied with a sadness that was not bitter. I will speak to her today, and I will try to keep the words that matter from her until the words that must be said are ready to be said. He sent a man with gray in his beard and an old scar along his jaw to stand at the postern Varys named, to look like nothing more than a watchman who has learned to lean on his spear without falling asleep. He did not go himself. He sat with a ledger and pretended to care about particulars of pickaxe and pulley. He watched the afternoon slide over stone and thought of the geography of promises. When the boy came quietly in to say that the boat had slipped from its place and the old man who had paid for it with a ring had gone to sleep on a cart and would be discovered in an alley without that ring, he nodded without letting his breath show. By then Robert had forced himself into the hall and made himself look at the iron throne and not at the dead thing beneath its steps that had been a dragon. He had a way of forcing himself to confront the thing he feared to become, and hating it, and then binding it to him with oaths of opposition that he would later forget. He stared at the throne until his jaw clicked, and then he turned to Eddard and roared. "Where are they?" "Your men search," Eddard said. "We have sealed the gates." "Sealed gates did not keep me out of this city," Robert snarled. He was sweating. The wound in his side throbbed like a second pulse under his skin, and the maester hovered near him with a cloth that stank of things that used to be herbs before they were stewed and drowned in spirits. "I will not sit that thing until I know that the heads that might hatch dragons are on spikes." "You will not say that in this hall," Eddard said, and the words were flat but had the force of hammered iron. "You will say it outside where men are unaccustomed to hearing it. Here you must be accustomed to better." Robert shook with what might have been laughter if he had not been in pain. "Better? The man who sat there burned my father and brother. This one burned Tywin Lannister. Better cannot be built on such stone." "It can be built if men begin with it," Eddard answered. "We will not begin with children. Their father started with a woman in a bed, and a city paid," Robert said. "Do not paint me as a monster because I wish to put out every ember before men bring dry brush to it. I will paint you as what you make yourself," Eddard said. He did not look away. He had learned long ago that with Robert the thing that mattered most was the steadiness of the eye that met his. "If you sit that chair, you will sit it as a man who knows the names of the little ones he denies mercy to. You will not be drunk on the music of men saying 'Robert' and call it justice." Robert sagged then, as if someone had cut two straps that kept him upright. He put a hand to his wound and grimaced. "Gods curse you, Ned. You make me feel as if my own skin were filthy." "It is only sweat," Eddard said. "You need not decide this today." "I needed to decide it a year ago," Robert said. "I needed not to ride south for a girl whose hand I will never hold again." He made a sound then that might have been a sob that had taken the wrong path. "Take me out. I will see the sky and not that abomination. Give me ships. If I cannot have heads, give me ships." "Stannis will have them for you," Eddard said, and glanced to where a dark, dour figure stood by the door like a shadow that had learned to stand at attention. "Lord Stannis, the city is in hand. Dragonstone remains." Stannis Baratheon accepted his name with a curt nod. His mouth was a thin line. It had not learned to smile in the years when a boy learns it or never. "My brother says, 'Give me ships,' as if they were pheasants I kept under a hedge to fatten. There are ships. There should be more. Ships rot when they are not used. This is another thing the king did not know and did not wish to learn." "You will take Dragonstone," Eddard said. "The queen is there with her son." Stannis's eyes turned, slow as a siege engine. "Queen. She is his queen," Eddard said, with the same respect with which he would have said that a mountain was a mountain. "He is dead. She is still what she was." "She will be less," Stannis said. "She will be a woman who must yield. I will not starve a child if a gate opens. I will starve the island if it does not." He looked at Robert. "You will sign things. You will sit. You will let me do the work that you will later resent me for having done." Robert gave him an expression that had something like fondness in it, twisted by pain. "I will do all of that," he said. "Only bring me a victory that smells like the sea and not like this cursed city." Stannis left the hall with the long, purposeful stride of a man who has found at last something large enough for his anger to grind upon. He went to the armory, to the counting house, to the river where ships had been tied like goats to a line. He went to the harbor that smelled of fish and rot and hope, and shouted until a harbor that had learned to lie woke up with a start and began to tell the truth. Men who had worked under Aerys still jumped when they heard his voice. Men who did not know him learned very quickly that he did not waste his words and did not forget when a promise had been made. The night that followed bore the scurry of carpenters and the cadence of hammer on plank that made the docks sound like an army. He slept not at all, and when dawn came he did not look at it. On Dragonstone, nights were different. They had edges. The wind did not blow. It hit. Rhaella Targaryen had learned to sit in a certain chair when the wind came up so that it would press her into the back of it and not try to pull her to the floor. She watched the sky with its peculiar gift of depth in that place and put her hand on the swell of her belly with a tenderness that had never been answered with gratitude. "I have failed you," she said to the child within, not in bitterness but as a woman might admit a debt. "You will take your last breath in a cradle with salt on it." Willem Darry knelt beside her with the slowness of a man whose knees had learned he had once fallen from a horse badly and did not like to do it again. "Your Grace, the fishermen speak, always the fishermen speak, but their talk has a shape now. They say sails have been seen at evenfall. Lord Stannis will bring you a circle of wood and a hunger." "We have already been hungry," Rhaella said gently. "It is a hearth guest in this castle." "We have grain for 3 months," Darry said. He did not say that grain could be made to last 6 if men were selected to die. "Do not measure for me. I have measured too many little graves," Rhaella whispered. She looked at her sleeping son. Viserys had learned that tears often brought him only a stern word, and so he saved them for moments that earned him no sympathy. He slept with the stubbornness of the young who do not yet believe sleep will ever be taken from them. "You will take him if you can." "I will take both," Darry said. "You will take him," Rhaella repeated. "You will take that which might be saved, and you will not lie to me about what cannot." Darry bowed his head. He had been a young knight once, and his vows had sounded in his ears like music. Now they sounded like coins counted out slow and put on a scale. "A storm is coming," he said instead of the other. "The island will be quieter at its heart, but the water will become a hand that crushes the mouth of the harbor. On such a night, men who know the water can slip where men who know lines and orders think no one would dare." Rhaella smiled. It made her look for a moment like the girl who had stood beside a boy with silver hair and believed that gods had made them as examples. "A storm," she said. "My children have always come with storms. When it broke, it did not begin with rain. It began with a pressure that built like a swallowed sob and then ricocheted along the cliff faces in. A roar. The sky took on a queer, pale bruise. The dragons carved on the castle seemed to lift their heads with hunger, as if they could drink wind. Rhaella's pains began then, as neatly as if a bell had rung. Darry went to fetch the midwives who had made their dens in the rooms nearest to the warm flues. He did not run. Running is for men who have not met death and learned that haste affronts it. Viserys woke with a terror that he would later not remember except as a taste like metal. The walls shook, which no child should ever see a wall do. Willem carried him to a lower room with a hearth that breathed enough to speak over the wind and set him on a pallet near men with faces like the carved prows of ships, men who had ropes for hands. "Your mother is strong," Darry shouted into his ear, and the boy nodded, and did not know why the man had shouted. In chambers above, women shouted softer and with a different shape to their voices. The storm centered itself and then narrowed and then came down like a god. Flames blew sideways as if the world had been picked up and tilted. Rhaella rode pain like a horse she had learned as a girl did not love her, but would carry her so long as she did not try to hold it with both hands. She did not scream. She had learned, after the second grave, that screaming angered whatever listened. When the child came, she came with hair matted by salt and with a smallness that would have made a different woman despair and put the child to a breast with a sigh. Rhaella's breast gave little. The midwife rubbed the tiny back and spoke a prayer in the cracked voice of a woman who had blasphemed often enough to think the gods might recognize her without introduction. The baby breathed in a thin ribbon and then cried in outrage at the nature of air. Riella reached for her and held her and laughed, not from joy, but from the relief of having bent and not broken. "What will you call her?" the midwife asked. The wind answered with a blow that rattled shutters. Riella closed her eyes, and in the black behind them saw tides and ships and places she had never been and would never be. She saw a city that burned green and did not. She saw a boy with a thumb in his mouth and a girl whose small hands had learned to untie knots. "Daenerys," she said. "She will belong to sea and air, since fire has made itself an enemy." When the cramps that mean blood loss started, Riella did not speak of them. She held the child and breathed through a mouth that dried as quickly as a puddle in sun. The women, who had seen such things and could say nothing to stop them, did what their mothers had taught them to do. They heated wine and water and sometimes their own hands when there was nothing else to heat. They put their bodies between the mother and the draft that insists on a woman's marrow when it likes the taste of it. When Derry came to take the baby, she held on for a moment, and he thought she would refuse. Then she lifted the small thing she had made and put her in his arms with the terrible grace of a queen who has learned at last what leaving truly is. "Take them," she said. "Both of them." He took them. The window shutters banged and one flew open and showed him for an instant the harbor roped with foam and a catspaw of waves that had climbed a set of stone steps as if using a ladder. He went down into the belly of the castle where dragons slept in carvings and stone had been worn smooth by men who had made stairs that were also mouths. He met 3 men whose hands were so calloused they made no sound on rope. He put the children into a basket a woman had lined with a cloak she had never liked but had kept because it was too fine to sell. They went down into the storm, and the storm took them and made of them the sort of small, determined figures history admits only when it feels generous. The boat they used was not the best. The best boats had owners with names and obligations. This boat had a leak that knew how much it was permitted to take. It had a sail that could not stand up to such anger and so was rolled and kept aside. It had oars that had been mended with leather and would break again if one did not listen to their complaints. The men rowed with the rhythm of men who have learned that death can be made to wait if asked in the right tone. A wave stood up in front of them like a man who has decided not to move, and they pushed him sidewise and slid past. On the quay, a barrel rolled with a slow, dignified malice and knocked a boy who had not yet learned to fear barrels into the sea. Another man reached in and found him by the hair and pulled him out with the same hand he used to pull nets. They made the harbor mouth in a burst of rain that turned the world into a curtain. Beyond it, the sea was a sheet that had been shaken by a giant and could not settle. The men aimed the boat's narrow nose at a place they could not see but had known when they were boys by the shape of the sound. The island fell away behind them and was no longer a place but a story men told about a thing that raised storms. The children slept because sometimes gods are not cruel, or because the rocking that could have undone them had the exact shape of a cradle. At dawn, when the wind had spent itself on the vanity of its own shouting, a bigger ship with cut-down masts and a crew who had once smuggled casks of wine and now smuggled whatever would buy bread found them and took them aboard. By then, a man on a headland would have been able to see the shape of Stannis Baratheon's sails curling around Dragonstone like a net. Back in the city, the third day gave men permission to stand straighter and to speak in voices that were not whispers. Carts began to move again with barrels and with grain sacks that had been opened by honest hands and not by knives. Men whose work was to make other men's words into pictures on parchment got ink under their nails and complained to one another about the size of letters, as if they had not been forced to pretend for the last year that rumors were news. The septs filled because men liked to hear that their gods had shaped what had happened and had plans to shape what would, and because a man who bowed his head could rest his neck muscles after too much looking up at walls and down at the ground where blood had run. Cersei Lannister came up from the camp with her hair braided so tightly that there were no flyaway strands to betray the night she had not slept. She wore a gown that did not flatter her but did not admit it. When boys with cudgels and armbands barred her at the gate, she gave them a look she had inherited from a father who had not wasted words on fools, and they moved aside. She walked the corridors as if they had been hers once and someone had made a mistake and lent them to a madman for a very long week. She found her brother behind a guarded door. The guard let her in with a reluctance that had less to do with orders than with the way the sister's eyes told him he was not present. Jaime stood when she entered. The room smelled of iron and of the subtle sourness of sweat that has dried and not yet been washed away. He looked thinner, which was ridiculous given the time that had passed. He looked older, which could be true for any man in that place. "Do you want me to say I am sorry?" she asked, and her voice was too bright. "It is a strange word in my mouth. Our language should have a different one for when a man is burned like a letter." He set his hands on the table because they were steadier when they touched wood. "I do not want you to say anything you do not mean. I do not know what I mean," she said. She stepped to him and took his face in her hands and examined it as if someone had sent her a counterfeit and she needed to find the flaw. "Perhaps that is new. Men have always told me what I will mean and I have let them. Our father did. He put words into my mouth like jewels and told me how to shine them. Now he does not. Now there is only you." "There is Tyrion," Jaime said, and knew he should not have said that until he saw the way her eyes shuddered. "Tyrion is a jest the gods persisted in," she said flatly. "Our uncles will lift him up because they think themselves wise, and our bannermen will pretend to take him seriously because they need to be seen in the same room as a Lannister. But whoever sits in our father's chair will not have legs short enough to swing." "Kevin will keep the rock," Jaime said. "He has always been better at keeping than men gave him credit for. He will not put his name on it if there is another name to put." "Your name," Cersei said, looking at the white that lay like frost over his shoulders. "He put you in a cage of honor to keep you from the place you were born for. The cage kept. Does it still? Do you want me to break it?" Jaime asked. He did not know when he asked whether he was taunting or pleading. "I want you to be what father wanted," she said, and the first real grief moved in her voice then. "I want there to be one man who makes me feel as if the world can be held and shaken and set down where I say, 'He is ash. You killed a king.'" She blinked and looked at him with a sudden, piercing clarity. "I do not know who you are to me now. I do not know who I am to me," he answered, and they both laughed a little because it was either that or begin to break. She bent and pressed her forehead to his, and for a moment they could pretend that the shape of their foreheads and their breath had been fashioned to fit. "Marry Robert," he said into the warmth between them, and she jerked back as if the suggestion had a blade. "It is what will be asked. It is what you may ask of yourself." "You tell me to go to a man whose hands break what they hold," she whispered. "You tell me to tie myself to a creature who sings to hear his own name. You tell me to open my legs for a boar. Why? Because there are other ways to hold power than by standing next to it with a sword," he said. "Because our house will not be ended by a madman's whim. Because our father will only stop dying when something of his is in a place that cannot be dragged into a hall and made to scream." She took that in and put it away like a knife for later. "Will you serve him?" she asked. "When he has done with hating you for doing the work he was too slow to do? Will you stand behind him in white and call yourself what they call you and swallow it?" "I killed a man who would have burned a city," Jaime said. "They will write names for me because men like to put what they fear into tidy letters. I will stand where I can and try to stop other fires." He looked at his hands. "I will be what I can." She stared at him as if searching for a lock in him that she still possessed the key to. When she could not find it, she put a hand to his cheek and let it linger a moment more than some sister should. "Hold," she said softly. "Hold yourself. The rest we will find a way to hold together." When she left, he sat and let the silence fill his ears until he could hear his own blood move. He felt very tired and very awake. As a man does the first night he keeps vigil over a body he has helped to wash. In the west, a letter arrived at Casterly Rock with the midday meal. Tyrion Lannister took it in hands that had ink on their middle 3 fingers and broke the seal with a nail he kept too long for just this purpose. The seal had been pressed more deeply than it needed to be, as if the wax had offered resistance to the signet and the man who wielded it had insisted. He read it in the courtyard under a lemon tree that his father had suffered some lady to plant on a summer when she had been pretty enough for the indulgence. The fruit hung like small suns and disappointed the tongue when bitten. Tyrion read his uncle's plain hand and the plainer words, and laughed because his throat would not let him do anything else without closing. He sat, still as a cat that has accepted a blow and is pretending that it was a petting, and watched the leaves move. He had not loved his father. He had not hated him enough. He had considered, privately, the possibility that his father could not be killed by a thing as ordinary as fire. Now he considered that even men like Tywin could be made to dance by heat if placed correctly. He drank wine that had not been poured for him and considered whether to sit down to write a reply that would deliver comfort. He decided against it. Kevin would have wives and children and stewards enough to bring him bread. What Tyrion would send would smell of wit, and wit made men on the edge of grave and duty angry. He shut his eyes and saw a man with a pale mask of a face bent over a map, and then he saw nothing. At Sunspear, a chill came through the stone that had nothing to do with wind. Doran Martell's hands were soft with rich man's lotions, but his knuckles looked as if they had been rubbed upon brick. The letter he read did not tremble. Oberyn walked the length of the solar with his boot heels making small, sharp sounds as if killing tiny insects. "What does it say?" he asked. He did not ask whether their sister was alive. He had already measured the various possible shapes of that news and how his breath would move in his chest when each was spoken. "It says nothing in words," Doran said. "It says that men have taken a city and not taken what we will insist must be denied them under all circumstances. It says that our sister may yet be warmed with blankets and not with a sheet. It says that a man I did not expect to understand anything has understood something." "Oberyn," the younger prince said, when his brother did not speak, and there was a gentleness in his voice that did not accord with the title he wore in his youth. "You must not saddle your horses. I will saddle them in my mind," Oberyn said lightly. "It does the same work to those who would stop me without giving them the satisfaction of seeing my dust." He came and put his hand on the letter as if it were a glass, and he wished to feel the condensation on its outside. "I will drink with Kevin Lannister one day and tell him that his measure saved him one friend and one enemy. I do not know which you are in this. We are all men of the realm," Doran said. "That makes us enemies and friends by calendar." He folded the parchment very carefully and slid it under a paperweight shaped like a sand viper. "Prepare writs. If our sister comes, the doors will be shut and the windows barred, and no one will know what has come through them. We will be windless. We will be sea. We will be rumor." Oberyn smiled without humor. "At last, something that will make me keep still," he said. "Send for Aerys. If there is a boat that thinks it may want to come ashore in the night, I want it seen and unseen." By the 5th day, a habit had begun to form in the Red Keep. Men went to certain rooms because they had learned in the short time available that those rooms would produce answers and not noise. They asked Eddard Stark questions and left with tasks. They brought Robert Baratheon choices and left with growled assent. They brought Varys whispers and left with the peculiar comfort that comes from having one's suspicions made articulate. They brought Ser Kevin Lannister grievances and left with a promise that the grievance would be weighed, not flattered, and that the scale would not tip toward red or toward stag. Pycelle came too, wheezing under the weight of his own beard and of an office that had sat for years like a robe upon a man who no longer needed warmth. He spoke of precedent and of the right of a conqueror and of the mercy that looks like indifference when looked at from the wrong end of a hall. He persuaded himself that he had wept in the right rooms. He sat at Robert's right hand and told the man that what he desired was the desire of the realm. Barristan Selmy arrived on a litter, pale and hard and embarrassed to be carried. He insisted on rising to his own feet to bow to the man who would soon be a king, and then he steadied himself on a chair and looked at the boy in white in the corner. "Sir," he said.
"Sir," Jaime answered.
"Why not in your own mail?" Barristan asked, with no venom, only the curiosity of a man who has not given cynicism lodging all the way to his heart. "Because I meant to be judged," Jaime said. "Steel wishes to be used. It makes a man stand like he is meant to make it ring." "Perhaps," Selmy said. and he would have said more, but the muscle in his thigh decided then to remind him of the spear point it had swallowed. He sat and allowed the pain to wash his face and leave his eyes sharp. "You killed a king," he said when he had breath in a good shape again. "The last man who did that ended with a sword through him and a song that cut a family." He did not ask why. He looked at Eddard Stark and then at Robert, and something like the shadow of a decision moved across his features. "If he had not, we would all stink of burned fat today. When you sit a chair, my lord, choose the stories you allow your realm to keep." Robert's laugh was brief and not merry. "You would put pretty words on an ugly act, Ser Barristan." "I would put accurate words on a necessary one," Barristan said. "And I would keep my sword for when it is needed next. Swords rust if men are made to swear on them too often." When the court assembled, such as it was, to hear proclamations that would make the city function like a place where men make bread and not a battlefield, Eddard noted that Littlefinger was not present. The man had not yet made his way to the city, and for a fleeting instant Ned was grateful for an absence he had not known to wish for. He saw instead the hard, familiar faces of his own men and the equally hard faces of men who had worn red yesterday and looked now to Kevin for their cue. He saw 1,000 mouths that would repeat what he said, and knew that was what words are for. When it was over, he went to a room he had come to think of as his own and closed the door and finally permitted himself to sit and take a breath all the way to the bottom. It tasted of wax from the candle that had burned the whole time he had been gone, and of the lemon oil some careful servant had used on the table. He put both hands flat on the wood and felt its cool through his palms. Later, he would ride south and west, following a rumor that had the shape of a place where men in white had gone to keep a promise that had not been made to a king. He would ride not as a hand or as a lord making himself important with retinues, but as a man who has remembered the exact tone of his sister's voice when she had asked him to keep her safe before she had known what keeping meant. He would ride with men who had learned their loyalty could live in the length of a sword arm and in the space a body makes behind a shield. But that would be later. Now he took up a quill and wrote to Winterfell. He wrote to a boy who had not yet measured his father's silence as it fell on a room, and to a girl who would come to love lemon cakes for what they tasted like and for the sound a plate makes when placed by a careful hand before the idea of dessert is introduced. He wrote that the snows were not near and that he would return when they were, which was a way of saying that he did not know. He wrote to a woman whose eyes had learned to consider how far a river could carry a man and what that did to the bones that did the carrying. He did not write everything. He wrote enough. He sealed it and sat for a moment longer and then blew out the candle because waste bothered him even now, in a place where waste had been made an art. He stood, and the weight of what had been done and what would be asked of him settled on his shoulders as if it had been designed for them. Down the corridor, Varys moved like a shade. He paused at a window and looked west, and for an instant his careful face became a human one in which relief moved like a fish in a bowl. Somewhere out there a boat he had purchased and then pretended not to know existed had touched ashore, and a woman with sand in her eyes had breathed out all the way and wept in a place where crying did not echo. He adjusted his sleeve and moved on. The work of keeping kings had not become easier for the removal of a mad one. It had only become different. On the river, Stannis' ships had found a rhythm that would become a memory of labor for the men who took oars and set them and pulled until their shoulders screamed. They scouted coves and lists of rocks men kept in their country's mouths. They threw lines to one another and learned to say each other's names without liking them. On the hills above, boys chased dogs and tried to teach them new tricks, and the dogs pretended to learn. In the rock, Tyrion sat at his father's desk and let his small hands rest on wood that his father's larger hands had given orders upon. He listened to a steward kneel and admit that a shipment of tin had not come because the rains had made the road marsh. He told the steward to speak to the miners' wives and put meat in their pots because men worked more efficiently when their children did not cry at night, and also because it was the decent thing. He had his goblet filled and did not drink at all. He leaned back and imagined writing something shocking and true and folded that thought up and tucked it behind his tongue. He looked at the sea and did not wonder what the world would become now that it had one less man in it who could bend it. In Sunspear, Doran moved pieces on a board he kept not for the pleasure of the game but because he liked shapes to be visible before they took him by surprise. He moved a ship from one square to another and then left it there and went to a window that opened on a courtyard where oranges grew and thought, very carefully, about how to keep a secret so that it did not turn poisonous for want of air. In King's Landing, the bells stayed quiet. When they rang again, it would be for a coronation, and men would try to hear, over the shine of trumpets and the bright talk of the hopeful, the undertone of a city that had nearly burned and had not. Some would hear it, most would not. That is the way with undertones. The sun slanted, shadows pooled like ink. Work continued because work is what men are made for when there is no fighting to be done. Eddard laid out a small pile of parchment that had to do with bread and sewage and argued with ink over whether it should approve a thing today or make it wait until another thing could be approved with it, so that the man who did both would not have to come twice. When he had finished, he rolled his shoulders and felt all the miles he had come from the snow and the quieter light of the north. He tied a ribbon around what must be kept from being scattered by a stray draft. He set his palm upon it for a moment and felt, briefly, foolish for pretending that the warmth from his skin could make a thing so cold as a city warmer. Somewhere down the corridor, Robert's laughter boomed. It had wine in it and pain, and the old boy who had yanked Eddard into the river and then waded in to pull him out. It echoed and did not echo. The Iron Throne sat in its gallery like a beast gone to sleep full and would wake hungry. Men would decide and then change their decision, and then pretend they had never had any other. The days would unspool, and knots would be made in them and then untied. A storm that had taken 2 children and given back 2 children would become a story with names. At the edge of all of it, like a boundary in the mind, a tower that had no place on any map stood and waited. In Eddard's dreams that night, it had a door that was always on the other side of wherever he stood, and a sound behind it like breathing. He woke in the false dawn when the birds have not yet begun and lay with his eyes open and listened for the bells. They did not ring. He heard, instead, his own heart and the city's. When the birds did begin, their calls sounded unambitious and decent, as if they asked only for seed and not for crowns. Men rose and strapped on what days require and went out and did not think themselves part of any story. That was a mercy the gods had made for them, that a man could be held up by a kingdom built of other men's habits and never be aware that he was what the earth walked upon. In that mercy, and in the shadow of what had not burned, the work of making a realm from ashes that had been kept in jars began.